was I talking about Valentine's Day when I could be covering the most important holiday of the year? Tonight I'm going to talk to you about Halloween, the late 70s John Carpenter version versus the late 2000s Rob Zombie version. And for those of you who are not familiar with the story of Halloween and are most likely living under a rock, Halloween is about this guy named Michael Myers who snapped one Halloween night when he was a kid and was put away for a while. 15 years later, he breaks free and returns to his hometown, and bloodshed ensues. So let's start off by talking about some of the supporting characters in the films. Now, in both the original and the remake, the main character is actually this girl named Laurie Strode, who Michael Myers comes after on Halloween night. I'll get into her a little bit later, but in both films she has to babysit these two kids on Halloween night. In the original, you've got this annoying little boy who doesn't shut up and just keeps asking question after question, and then there's this little girl who is also annoying in her own way because she's just very quiet and just doesn't give a shit about anything. In the Rob Zombie version, they're actually a lot more annoying, although I didn't personally mind this too much. They were actually pretty funny in parts, and if you've ever had to deal with kids in real life, they can get that annoying. My only kind of nitpick in the remake, as far as the kids go, is that the little girl has this scream that just sounds very forced, and it sounds like a movie scream that she had prepared for. Then there's a sheriff in both versions of the film. There's not really quite as much to say about him. In John Carpenter's version, he's just kind of this likable side character. In the Rob Zombie film, I think he's a lot more intense, especially when he's sitting down to interview Michael Myers' old psychiatrist, Dr. Loomis. Also, Laurie Strode has a pair of friends, and one of them is just an irresponsible babysitter who dumps the kid that she's babysitting on Laurie so that she can go sleep with someone. And I would say that she about breaks even for both versions. She's a fun character in the original, and she's a fun character in the Rob Zombie movie. I do think it's actually pretty cool that Rob Zombie cast Danielle Harris in his movie. For those who don't know, she was the little girl in Halloween's 4 and 5. And then Laurie Strode's got this cheerleader friend who, in the John Carpenter movie, is just the stereotypical kind of cheerleader that people imagine, who's not very bright, doesn't give a shit about schoolwork or books, and is kind of shallow, but at the same time, she is a pretty funny character. In Rob Zombie's movie, she's not quite as funny as she is just a bitch. And in all honesty, I couldn't give much of a shit about her in the Rob Zombie film. Also, let's talk real quick about the fuck ton of characters in Rob Zombie's film that were not in the original. Now, I've heard one guy complain about the fact that Rob Zombie's Halloween is essentially a Devil's Rejects reunion show, and I can see how that would be a little distracting, but personally I didn't mind it too much. I love Ken Foree and Danny Trejo, and I enjoyed seeing them in the film, and I didn't mind their characters too much. Also, Sid Haig appears briefly, as a character who was in the John Carpenter version. Again, didn't mind seeing him. There are a couple of other Devil's Rejects alumni who are actors that I don't mind, but I minded their characters a bit. Like, there's this guy who works at the institution where Michael is being held, who is just played up to be the biggest piece of shit in the world. And, you know, the scene where Michael breaks out of the place would have been scary if it had been due to his own violent nature, or even if it was due in some part to some small negligence on the staff's part. But instead, he breaks out due to this guy I just mentioned acting as horrible and as stupid as possible. And then you know another scene that could have been a lot scarier, the one where Michael Myers stabs a nurse in the neck. Like, there's this scene where he's still a child, and this nurse sits down to watch over him, and it would have been scary if she had just been, like, minding her own business, or even if, God forbid, she had been nice to him. But instead, she sits down and just says something really mean to him, which, let's face it, a registered nurse would never have said to a little kid. Now, in talking about Michael's parents, I actually don't mind Sherry Moon Zombie as Michael's mother. She is actually one of the only characters in the first half who manages to be likable, and some of the scenes where she's visiting young Michael in the institution are fairly heartbreaking to watch. And then there's Michael's dad. Now, I I like the idea of having Michael grow up in this broken home. By all means, make his dad a piece of shit, but in this film, he's just so over the top that you can't really buy him as being a real person. He just feels like an unfunny parody of the piece of shit dad. Moving on, before I get into the main characters from both films, I'd like to touch on the endings real quick. And I'm not going to spoil them for anyone who hasn't seen either version of Halloween, but essentially in John Carpenter's version, the ending felt a lot more creepy and ominous, whereas in the Rob Zombie version, it was just really bloody and violent. So in talking about some of the main characters and aspects from both films, first of all, you've got this guy named Dr. Loomis. He is the psychiatrist who was tasked with looking after Michael after the night that he snapped. Essentially, he tried to find a way to bring this kid back to humanity before he finally realized that there was no going back for him, and ultimately decided that it would be best to keep him locked up for the rest of his life. And then after Michael breaks out of the institution, Loomis makes it his mission to find him and take him down. Now, in the original, this character is played by a guy named Donald Pleasance, and, Pleasance plays the character as a little bit crazy. He's very angry about the fact that Myers was able to get out, and he's also terrified, understandably so, of what he is capable of doing. And he is still basically likable at the same time. Easily my favorite scene with him in the movie is where these kids are trying to pull some Halloween prank at the Myers residence when Loomis scares them off just to get scared shitless himself a minute later. Now, Malcolm McDowell as Dr. Loomis in the Rob Zombie film is easily the best character in the movie. He starts off very warm and likable and open, and the best part about seeing Michael's origin story is seeing the process in which Dr. Loomis tried to reach out to him and tried to, sort of pull him back to humanity. And you almost root for him to accomplish this mission, even though you know it's eventually going to fail. And, during the second half of the film, when Michael does break out and Loomis goes after him, his mission feels much more justified, and you can actually feel a little bit of sympathy for the character. Now moving on to Laurie Strode, the main target of Michael Myers in both movies. In the original, Jamie Lee Curtis plays her as just this very likable and intelligent young woman who's good with kids. She is a fairly simple character, and it's not even established in the first movie that she is Michael Myers' little sister. So the fact that he's just going after this young woman who is just trying to live her life and really hasn't done anything to deserve this does make her very sympathetic, and it does make the situation pretty terrifying. Now, in the remake, they do establish early on that she is the sister of Michael Myers. And it is kind of fucked up that you would have this serial killer in your family who is coming after you. And I do like the fact that Rob Zombie wanted to give her more of a sense of humor, but really, could she have been more annoying in the movie? She doesn't even feel like she's talking like a real person half the time. Like, there's that scene with the bagel where she's talking to her mother. Who talks to their own mother like that? Also, I forgot to mention earlier that Laurie Strode's parents have a lot more screen time in the remake, and I do kind of like that little addition. But again, just going back to Laurie Strode, she has a kind of similar scene to the bagel scene uh, that she's acting out in front of the kids that she's babysitting later on, and just no. That's why. And I know with such professional dialogue like that, you could easily see me as being the next Roger Ebert. Now, before I delve into the character of Michael Myers himself, I would like to touch on the murder scenes in both versions. Now, over the years, Michael Myers has become well known as this slasher movie icon, but really, if you go back and watch the original John Carpenter film, it's not much of a slasher movie. I mean, for one thing, it's not really bloody at all for the most part. And throughout the whole running time, I think he only kills like 4 people and 2 dogs. One of the dog kills happens off screen. But there are some pretty memorable death scenes in it nevertheless. Like, the cheerleader's death scene was fairly memorable just for how funny they played it. And then, of course, you've got the opening scene with the death of Michael Myers' sister. And, it starts off with that great first-person shot, and I could only imagine just being an audience member at the time this movie came out. People didn't even know who this Michael was. They didn't even know the age of this person that they were watching the movie through at the beginning. And then the reveal at the end of that scene is so chilling, it just makes it one of the best intros to a horror movie of all time. In Rob Zombie's movie, he ups the body count and ups the gore, which is But I will admit that the shock value did prove to be pretty effective in some cases, like the scene where it's discovered that Mrs. Myers' tombstone has been taken is a little more effective, I think, in Rob Zombie's film. And of course, during the first half of the movie, it is disturbing as all hell to see this little kid killing people, especially in that one scene where he hits the guy in the head with the aluminum bat, and instead of just being knocked out cold, you see his body convulsing on the floor. I mean, you can comment down below and tell me that you were not in the least bit disturbed by Rob Zombie's remake, but I'm not going to believe you. And now on to the main attraction himself. In the original film, Michael Myers doesn't have as much of a backstory, and he really doesn't need one. He is just someone who snapped one night, and then, of course, most of the running time is devoted to just presenting him as this very quiet and menacing presence, and it builds up a lot of these feelings of tension and dread before he finally moves in for the kill, and it makes the final act of the movie that much more effective. And I also just like the way that he's shot in the movie. Aside from that long first-person shot at the beginning, one of the most memorable shots of him in the movie is where he's coming after Laurie Strode, and you get this moment where she's just leaning against a wall, gasping for breath, when Michael Myers just suddenly materializes out of the darkness and comes after her. Now, I've already expressed that I don't mind the origin story that Rob Zombie created, and some people have argued that Michael Myers doesn't even need an origin story, which is completely fair. But when he set out to make this movie, he didn't have the goal in mind to just recreate John Carpenter's Halloween all over again. He wanted to make Rob Zombie's Halloween. And while I do have some gripes with the origin story, like with the dad and the nurse, as well as the character of Michael Myers himself, which I'm not even going to get into, I do think that it was a pretty interesting reimagining of the character, in that you got to see more of this de-evolution that he went through before finally turning into a monster. And I think it's a pretty interesting concept to have him create these masks that he hides behind as he becomes increasingly removed from humanity, and they ultimately become his new face. And it's also kind of interesting how later on in the film there's this brief moment between him and Laurie Strode where he starts to show a small glimmer of humanity. However, he still doesn't have the same impact as Myers from the original film. You don't really need to have more sympathy for the character or even show more scenes with him killing people to make him a terrifying presence. Now, when I saw Rob Zombie's Halloween for the first time many years ago, it was actually my favorite movie for a while, and I was kind of apprehensive as I was preparing to revisit it, as I was sitting down and rewatching John Carpenter's version and remembering everything that Rob Zombie had done with his movie. I was kind of expecting to end up hating it, but even though it's not a perfect movie by any stretch, there are enough positives going for the film to where I can sit down and enjoy it. But at the same time, it doesn't retain as much rewatch value as the John Carpenter movie. The original didn't need to be gory. It didn't need to delve deep into Michael Myers' backstory. And it didn't need to have people cussing each other out every 5 minutes or less. Ultimately, he just made this very simple, elegant, terrifying, and ultimately superior film. And that is all I have to say about this comparison. I hope you all have a good one.